Good day, class. Welcome to Building Tech 2. Okay, so like what I have emphasized in the past weeks, we will focus on making drawings for construction and for building permit purposes. So I think that's one of the main reasons why you are taking this course. So for you to fully grasp the importance of the drawings that you're doing, so let's discuss about the 12 steps of construction, which is the pattern that uh, how we do uh, work in the building industry. Okay, so this is one. I think the thing that's going to discuss here is for a bigger project, but you can also scale that down. So it's important that before you graduate architecture that you understand this. Okay, I think in your lower building technology lessons, you already discussed about the different materials such as concrete, steel, wood, glass. Okay, so I think you already have some grasp and understanding on the different materials to be used. Okay, now let's look at those materials in the context of the construction industry.
12 steps of construction. Once the construction drawings and other related documents have been completed and approved by the authority in jurisdiction, the project will then
So here in the Philippines, class, the authority and jurisdiction, that's what you call the uh, OBO, or the Office of the Building Official under the DPWH.
be awarded to a contractor by the client through a consultant. In this period, the construction of the proposed project will begin. Construction can be summarized into 12 stages. 1. Clearing of the ground.
Okay, so first is site clearing or clearing of the ground. Okay, here in the Philippines, class, when you are doing just small residential buildings, the first thing you're gonna do is clear. For example, if you're going to build a house in a gated community or a high-end subdivision, first thing you're going to do is clear the ground. So what you're going to do? So you may be cutting some grass or removing some large boulders at the site which may impede your project.
To begin the actual construction, the clearing of the ground from where the location of the project will be built is the first thing to consider. The construction personnel task is to free the construction site for any obstruction and debris that may obstruct and delay the construction. The temporary facilities such
Okay, so another thing to consider, class, when you are clearing the ground are the tempasil or the temporary facilities. Okay, so here in the Philippines, you have to make a small space for your foreman, a small storage space for the materials. Okay, and you must have a space where you're going to store the plants also. Okay, so you must make sure that these spaces are safe and your materials won't get wet, especially your concrete bags or cement bags.
as engineer's office, labor's quarter, material storage room, temporary water, and electric supplies and other related facilities should also be constructed prior to the start of work.
So another part, last, of your temporary facilities for smaller projects, like here in the Philippines, when you're doing residential buildings, is that you must have a space uh, where your people or your construction personnel will excrete. You have to have a toilet for them. You have to have a space where they can cook also for their lunch.
A site perimeter fence should also be constructed during this period. 2. Site
So why is it important, last, that you must have a site perimeter fence? That's to prevent other people from going in and out of your construction site. Okay, uh, there are many reasons why you don't want other people to get inside your construction site. One is that you don't want people to be stealing materials from you, and another reason is that you want to protect the community from hazards during construction. Okay, there might be children playing around will go inside your construction site and they might get hurt. Okay, because there's a lot of hazards inside the construction site. You might have some nails lying around or some heavy objects at the top which might fall down. Okay, so you have to prevent pedestrians from getting inside. So only those who are involved with the project should be within the construction premises. So the next step is site layout and staking.
Layout and staking. This activity involves the setting of the reference points in a form of construction grid lines and marking off the gate level. This is performed to ensure that the grids have been set up on site according to approved plans. The reference point should be marked properly and should not be disturbed throughout the course of the construction. Grid lines according to the approved drawing should be laid out prior to construction. Depending on the complexity and size of the project, the construction grids can be laid out through the use of theodolite or related surveying instruments. A more traditional way of the layout of the construction grid is popular to use for small projects is through staking using batter board.
Okay, so for smaller projects, like here in the Philippines, when you're doing residential buildings, you're going to use the batter board and string. But to do that last, you have to have in your team a licensed surveyor or geodetic engineer to ensure that what you are building is within the property of your client. Because it's going to be a very complicated process once you build a house or structure in the wrong lot.
Board and strings. Batter board are temporary wooden frames used to suspend the strings. The strings are the representation of the
Okay, so notice last that I think in my past videos I've shown you some of my projects which has these lines here. So the X and Y directions. So these lines they act as your guide. Okay, when you are building. Okay, so you're going to use these lines as reference points in your construction. Okay, so you must make sure that they are properly represented in the ground so that your construction will be accurate as much as possible. Okay, but construction class is not a perfect art. It has some discrepancies, but your role as the architect or project manager is to ensure that there are as much less mistakes as possible. Okay?
grid lines at X and Y directions according to approved plans. These will serve as a guide throughout the construction, so it is important to fix a reference line in both directions to be used once the grids have been placed when needed in the construction. 3. Excavation. Once the layouts of construction points and grid lines have been completed, the excavation works begin. The excavation depth depends on the recommendation by the Soil Investigation Report. But it is safe to say that the minimum excavation level for the footing to rest should stick to 1 meter below the gate level or the 0.00 level. Excavation works is a massive activity, therefore a proper caution should be observed during this stage. In the event that the excavation needed is along with the neighbor's existing structure exceeding 1.20 meter from your proposed level, then shoring support is recommended. 4. Compact.
Okay, so shoring support last that is done so that uh, the soil won't collapse once you are doing your excavation. So if you have a neighbor on the other side or on the let's say that you have neighbors on the three sides of the building, so it's going to be a lot more complicated. So when you make sure that when you are excavating uh, in your construction site that you have enough shoring or support to ensure that the soil won't collapse, because soil class also exert pressure. Okay, so when you cut something, if the pressure from the other side of, for example, the other property is too great, then uh, the soil might erode and fall, and this might cause damage to the structure uh, beside your construction site. So you have to be very careful if you are building something which has neighbors on three sides, one side, or two sides. Okay.
And laying of PCC. Compacting of the excavated surface should perform once we reach the desired excavation level. A layer of crushed gravel is then to be added during the compacting. In a standard compaction procedure, the final compacted layer should be checked in order to reach the desired degree of compaction to not less than 95% of the maximum dry density. It is then in this stage that an anti-termite treatment on the ground should also be considered. The laying of PCC or plain concrete cement should follow afterward in preparation for rebar works. PCC is usually composed of a 10 mm thick lean concrete for the footing rebar to be laid evenly level. 5. Foundation rebar and column starter bars. Once the laying of PCC has been set up, the rebar works for foundation and any foundation beams are the next activity. In this stage, the reinforcement of foundations is being prepared according to the structural schedule along with its formworks. The proper and standard concrete cover should be observed during this procedure. Starter bars for columns should also be installed accordingly before concrete pouring. 6. Concreting of foundations and column rebar installation. Concreting of foundations has to come next after the rebar works. The concrete to be poured should be properly vibrated for the concrete, especially the aggregates, to fully spread into the footing.
Okay, so what's the reason, class, that you have to vibrate the concrete? So one of the reason is that so that the concrete will get into the different portions of your footing or your column or your beam. Okay, because if you don't have use a vibrator, there might be some pockets uh, that are not reached by the concrete. Okay.
Installation of column reinforcement on the previously installed column starter bars should be continued. A proper concrete cover should consider before closing the formworks. For substructure columns, an additional concrete cover of at least 50 mm has to be considered up to plinth level to protect the rebar for possible corrosion due.
Okay. So there are minimum standards, class, for your concrete cover. So in the Philippines, you have to make sure that your column is designed in accordance with the National Structural Code of the Philippines. Okay, but one way to ensure that is that you must have a structural engineer for the project. So when you're doing a large project class or even a small residential house building or house, you must really have your own set of engineers or consultants for it.
Due to sulfate attack. 7. Concreting of column and bitumen paint applications. Once the concreting of stub columns has been completed, give time for the concrete to dry completely and apply at least 2 coats of bitumen paint for both footing and stub columns. Bitumen paint helps in absorbing moisture due to the.
Okay, so I've seen this several times, class, in our projects. Uh, when I was still working overseas, bitumen is applied. But here in the Philippines, I think this is omitted, especially in most projects. Okay, so I don't know the reason why.
Soil to prevent seepage into the substructure concrete. 8. Setting up perimeter blocks. Install solid blocks along the perimeter or the edge of the proposed project. This is to establish a boundary between the inside and outside edges of the project. It is also helpful when the difference of inside floor finish level to outside pavement or ground level is significant. 2 coats of bitumen paints should also apply afterward. In some cases, perimeter blocks are optional, especially for areas where the soil characteristics are too firm. 9. Backfilling and compacting. Once the substructures like foundation structures including the solid blocks have been installed completed, backfilling and compacting should take place.
Okay, so buildings, class, when they design or construct buildings overseas, what they do is excavate the entire site. Then they do the foundations. But here in the Philippines, I think the practice that they most contractors are doing is that they just should call this excavate in accordance to the size of the footing. For example, if the footing is 1.2 meters by 1.2 meters, then they're going to dig a hole that is 1.2 meters by 1.2 meters, and then they'll just simply pour concrete. So I think one of the disadvantage of that is that you are not sure what shape the footing will follow once it has settled.
Backfilling and compacting should be done partially to make sure that the required degree of compacting has been met until reaching the bottom of the tie beam level. 10. Tie beam reinforcement, grade slab, and concreting. Preparation and installing the tie beam reinforcement as per the approved drawing is the next step to consider after the backfilling and compacting. Formworks with standard concrete cover are also included in this stage. Once the reinforcement works have been completed, we can start the concreting. Installing of grade slab mesh and concrete work is then to be followed. 11. Rebar works and concreting of columns. At this stage, the substructure component of our project has been completed. It is now time for the project to go up. The next thing to consider is the rebar works, shuttering or formworks and concreting to be done. Prior to concreting, we see to it that the columns follow the structural schedule. The formworks should be vertically level and a standard.
Okay, so this is one of the most important things to remember, class. Your formwork should be vertically level. Okay, so even when you're just doing small residential buildings, you have to check if this level. Okay, so that's why last week, I think in our lesson, I introduced to you some of the tools you're going to use in the site, such as your plumb bob. Okay, so it's really important to make sure that your column is really vertical. Because once it tilts slightly, your formwork tilts slightly, then after concrete pouring, when it already is a hard, it reaches its maximum strength, then you won't have a straight column. Okay?
Concrete cover has to maintain prior to the closing of forms. 12. Beam and slab works. Once the ground floor columns have been cast, it is time to prepare the project for beams and suspended slab reinforcement activity. Like any other structural members, beams and slab reinforcement should be followed strictly. Shuttering or formworks for slab and beams should be properly anchored and checked prior to concrete pouring. Step 11 can be repeated accordingly until such time that the structural frame or the core and shell of the structure has been completed. The architectural finishing works are then be followed. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so I think we've covered some of the basic steps in construction. Okay, so although the context in this video is based on doing larger projects, but it can be applied to smaller projects as well. Okay, what's important is that you have a basic grasp or understanding of what you're doing. So that is why, class, when you do your floor plans, you have to have the X and Y reference points in the drawing because they are really important, especially when you will be constructing the project already. Okay, so I think this will be our lesson for this week. I'll post our activity in our group page later. Okay, so stay safe, class. And then if you have any questions or clarifications, you can send me an email or send me a private message anytime, and I'll try to answer that to the best of my ability. Okay, so I hope you enjoy our journey in building technology. Okay, so stay safe and see you next week.